Number 14. Terrence breaks the ice. I was hoping Terrence would come back eventually. In this episode, Terrence decides to take a shortcut across a frozen lake to collect Christmas trees, but soon gets into trouble when the ice breaks underneath him, and Thomas had to come to his rescue. When it comes to Christmas episodes of Season 21, this is the best one, mainly because of Terrence's return appearance in full CGI. Although his Widow's Peak was missing, but I'm fine with that because it reminds me of illustrations in some of Christopher Audrey's books where he gained eyebrows and no Widow's Peak. In addition, it's about time Farmer Finney got a line in the show despite him being a retexture of Sir Topham Hatt. But hey, at least Keith Wickham does a decent job with his voice. Speaking of voice actors, even though I enjoyed Tom Stewarton's performance as Terrence, but I think that voice should have been UK exclusive because if you do research on his basis, then you know that he was built by Caterpillar, which is an American manufacturer. If Terrence had a US voice, then maybe he should sound a lot like Jack's US voice by David Menken. Lastly, I even like the episode's message about being careful and taking your own advice, as well as the flashback to Thomas Terrence in the snow. Aside from a few problems, I highly recommend this episode to anyone who is a fan of Terrence the Tractor. Number 13. The Beast of Sodor. If I could describe this episode into one word, it would be hilarious. First of all, I love how Sir Topham Hatt was portrayed as a comic relief in this episode, which is something we don't see that often. For example, I thought it was funny that Sir Topham Hatt got chased by a bull and later got covered in thick snow, which made Henry and Spencer believe that he was the Beast of Sodor. In addition, I love the bit where earlier in the episode, Henry, Spencer, and Dowager Hatt were like, "An abominable snowman?" And then Dowager Hatt was like, "Utter tish-tosh," after a brief record scratch. That has to be the best scene in the entire episode because it's that hilarious. And that's why this episode deserves a spot on this list. Number 12. The Missing Christmas Decorations. I never thought Diesel 10 would appear in an episode like this. The Missing Christmas Decorations is basically the Thomas version of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which in this case, it's Diesel 10 stealing all the stuff. Another interesting thing about this episode is that Norman and Sydney spoke for the first time, and their voice actors Keith Wickham and Bob Golding did a great job with their respective characters. Oh, and I also got to mention that they at least gave a good reason why Sydney has been inside the Diesel Works for a long time, as Norman told Percy that it's been about 2 years. Well, at least we now know Sydney's safe from the fire back in Day of the Diesels. Oh, and I also like the Thomas Majorero reference where Diesel 10 calls Sydney Twinkle Toes. Yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. I guess that's another reason why I think Thomas Magic Railroad is canon. In addition, I thought it was pretty ironic that the whole Steam team was chasing after Diesel 10 during the climax because it's usually the other way around. And it's even a nice throwback to Day of the Diesels as well. But the best part of the episode would have to be the ending where the Diesels gave the decorations back to Tim Sheds and that Sydney finally got his new wheels. And Percy's definitely right about Christmas being a time for giving and being kind. And those are all the reasons why I think this is the best Christmas episode of Season 17. Number 11. Love Me Tender. You may recall in my top 5 twins video where I put Donald and Douglas as the best duo when it comes to twin characters. When it comes to Christmas episodes of Season 20, Love Me Tender has to be the best one. I know I keep saying that a lot in this video, but it's true. Anyways, this is a Donald and Douglas episode where their job was to clear snow off the tracks, just like in the classic era. And as brothers, they sometimes bicker and argue, which would later cause Douglas's tenor getting detached, leading him to be stranded in the snow, and Donald will have to find and rescue him. The reason this is the best Christmas episode of Season 20 is because it's a proper return of the Scotch twin engines, and it shows how brothers should always stick together no matter how many times they argue. And I also think it's better than Emily in the Middle. Not to say that Emily in the Middle is a bad episode, it's just that Love Me Tender has better execution in terms of the episode's moral. Number 10. Bradford the Brake Van. Ah yes, Bradford. One of my favorite new characters introduced in Season 20. He's like the Blue Nose of Thomas and Friends, but without the obnoxiousness. He's also the third sentient brake van in the show, with the spiteful brake van being first, and Toad being second. Anyways, this episode marks the debut appearance of the character, and usually works with his friend Samson. What's useful about Bradford is that he's smart, strict in a good way, and knows how to keep the troublesome trucks in order. Though this does annoy Thomas and the other engines because it delays their trains. At first, I was worried that Bradford would be a one-off character, but he did return in Samson and the Fireworks, which is one of my favorite episodes in the Big World Big Adventures era, and I'll do a video on that eventually, but not right away. Another thing I like about Bradford is that he's not only strict, but can also be kind at times, like for instance, he does have a good sense of humor at the end of this episode. If you're a big fan of characters that are like Bluenose, then this is the perfect episode for you. Number 9. Toad's Bright Idea. When it comes to episodes starring Toad, this is my favorite one because it takes place during the events of Tale of the Brave. I also think it's the very best episode when it comes to Gator's roles. Although Long Lost Friend and Missing Gator are good episodes too, but I like this one more because I like the chemistry between him and Toad, and that Toad keeps reprimanding Gator about his wonky headlamp, so Toad has to give Gator one of his headlamps instead. It's also a great episode in terms of its message about being safe and secure, and Toad's definitely right about that. Number 8. Dowager Hat's Busy Day. This is a very funny episode. Let's get started on the premise of it. In this story, Sir Topham Hatt was feeling ill, and his mother had to take his place for a while, but she doesn't really know how to run a railway properly. There are a lot of things that made me laugh out loud here. For instance, I love the music they played at the beginning where Dowager Hatt was getting out of her car in a badass way. It's just so funny. I also think it's funny where she misnames the engines like calling Gordon Jeffrey, which is a reference to Who's Jeffrey. Seriously, how could you not like her? She's hilarious! But thankfully, she does get help from Emily, who teaches her that there are certain engines that are suitable for certain jobs. It also shows that Dowager Hatt isn't just hilarious, but she can be very smart too, just like her son. If there's one thing I don't like about this episode, it would be the brief reference to Up Up and Away where they showed a big red balloon on a flatbed. I know they did this for self-deprecating humor, but I still don't like that episode, and you all know why I put it as number 1 for the worst Sharon Miller episodes video. In conclusion, this is a really great and very funny episode, and I highly recommend it to anyone who likes comic relief characters like Dowager Hatt. Number 7. Goodbye Sir Topham Hatt. Also known as Goodbye Fat Controller in the UK, this episode revolves around the Steam Team believing that Sir Topham Hatt is going away, but it turns out it was just a misunderstanding in the end. You see, some painters came to Knapford Station to renovate his office while Sir Topham Hatt had to use a shed as a temporary replacement in the end. First of all, I think Rob Rackstraw did a great job voicing one of the painters. Am I the only one who thinks that that voice would fit well for Scruffy since it sounds old and scruffy? In addition, my favorite bit of all had to be the Steam Team going on strike, which is a reference to Trouble in the Shed. Oh, and speaking of that, I love how the Knapford Station Master said the line, "There's trouble in the shed, sir." Overall, this was a great episode, and it does have a good lesson that you shouldn't always believe everything you hear or see. And I think Sir Topham Hatt should always be the controller of the Northwestern Railway, no matter what. Number 6. Wayward Winston. In this episode, Winston gets tired of Sir Topham Hatt being an amateur driver, so he wishes that he would go on without one, which led to big trouble for him. I remember buying the Railway Mischief DVD back at Walmart because I was very excited to see these new episodes at the time. And my favorite one next to Steamy Stafford and Scruff's makeover was Wayward Winston. The reasons why I love this episode is that not only references Thomas Comes to Breakfast in terms of going off without a driver, but it's a pretty fun and exciting action episode where Thomas and Sir Topham Hatt had to chase Winston all over the island until he ran out of petrol in the end. I also think that Winston is a pretty cool and likable character, and Matt Wilkinson does a perfect job with his voice. Overall, this episode in my opinion was pretty intense and exciting, which means it's really good. And if you're a fan of Thomas Comes to Breakfast, then I'm sure you'll love this one as well.